Καλησπέρα σας σε όλους. Αξιότιμοι προσκεκλημένοι, αγαπητοί φίλοι, σας καλωσορίζω θερμά. Καλώς ήρθατε όλοι σας. Πρώτα απ' όλα θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω τον εκδοτικό οίκο Παπαζήσης και το φιλόξενο χώρο του IANOS για τη σημερινή εκδήλωση. Θα ήθελα επίσης να συστήσω τους αξιώματους καλεσμένους μας, ο καθηγητής Όρι Σόλετς, που διδάσκει στο Πανεπιστήμιο Georgetown. Τα μαθήματα που του καλύπτουν θέματα που εκτούντονται από την ιστορία της τέχνης και θεολογία έως τη φιλοσοφία και την πολιτική ιστορία. Είναι ιδιαίτερα παράγωγος στον ακαδημαϊκό και πολιτιστικό τομέα. Έχει συγγράψει ή επιμεληθεί περισσότερα από 25 βιβλία, άρθρα, κατάλογος, εκθέσεων και δοκιμία. Και ο καθηγητής Σόλετς έχει γράψει 2 βιβλία για το κίνημα Χισμέτ και για το Φετχουλλάχ Γκιουλέν. Σήμερα θα μιλήσουμε για το τελευταίο βιβλίο που έχει γράψει, για το Φετχουλλάχ Γκιουλέν, που μόλις κυκλοφόρησε στα ελληνικά από τις εκδόσεις Παπαζήσης, και μαζί μας είναι ο καθηγητής Σωτήρης Λίβας, που είναι καθηγητής διεθνών σχέσεων και ο οποίος μετάφρασε το έργο στα ελληνικά. Θα ήθελα να πω ότι σήμερα δεν βρισκόμαστε μόνο εδώ για την παρουσίαση ενός βιβλίου, αλλά και για να τιμήσουμε ένα πνευματικό ταξίδι που συνδέει τη σκέψη με την δράση, την θήκη με την κοινωνική ευθύνη και τον άνθρωπο με τον συνάνθρωπό του. Το έργο που το έχει γράψει ο καθηγητής Όρι Σόλετς, «Σκέψη και δράση», βασικά είναι μια πνευματική βιογραφία του Φετχουλλάχ Γκιουλέν, ξεπερνάει τα όρια μας, βασικά μια απλή βιογραφία, μας προσκαλεί να γνωρίσουμε έναν κόσμο ιδέων, σκέψεων, μια ζωή αφιερωμένη στο διάλογο, στην εκπαίδευση και στην ειρήνη και στην υπηρεσία προς την κοινωνία. Με την επιστημονική του ακρίβεια και τη βαθιά του γνώση, ο κύριος Σόλετς μας βοηθάει να δούμε πώς η προσωπική πνευματικότητα μπορεί να γίνει δύναμη κοινωνικού μετασχηματισμού. Ο σύμβολος, ο κύριος Σωτήρης Λίβας, το έχει μεταφράσει, όπως είπαμε, στα ελληνικά. Τα σχόλια και την ακαδημαϊκή επιμέλεια δίνει στον ελληνικό κοινό την ευκαιρία να προσεγγίσει το έργο με καθαρότητα, ακρίβεια και σεβασμό στο πρωτότυπο. Το βιβλίο αυτό μας καλεί να ξανασκεφτούμε έννοιες όπως το διάλογο, όπως ο εθελοντισμός στην εκπαίδευση, η κοινωνική συνοχή και ο πολιτισμός της ειρήνης. Μας θυμίζει επίσης ένα θεμελιώδες έρευνα, πώς μπορούν οι ιδέες και οι αξίες έναν άνθρωπο να εμπνεύσουν ολόκληρες κοινωνίες. Είναι η τιμή μας σήμερα που βρισκόμαστε εδώ για να συζητήσουμε αυτό το ερώτημα, να ακούσουμε τον συγγραφέα και τους εκλεκτούς ομιλητές και να μοιραστούμε το πνευματικό βάφος που προσφέρει το βιβλίο. Σας ευχαριστώ θερμά για την παρουσία σας και εύχομαι μια γόνιμη, να το πούμε, και εμπνευμένη εκδήλωση για τη σημερινή εκδήλωση. Θα ξεκινήσουμε με τον κύριο Σόλετς, μετά θα μιλήσει ο κύριος Λίβας και μετά θα ολοκληρώσουμε το διάλογο με τις δικές σας ερωτήσεις. Παρακαλώ, κύριε Σόλετς.
Καλησπέρα, οι αξαμνάρ. Είναι πάντοτε καλημέρα. Είναι στην Αθήνη και μαζί με Χισμέτ Ολμεκ. but I will speak in English, which may be safer. And I think the place to start, well, let me ask you a question. Because I can talk about Hoca Efendi, I can talk about Fethullāh Gülen, and I can talk about what is within the book that talks about Hoca Efendi, or I can talk about how I first encountered Hoca Efendi and how that led to the book. So, a show of hands, where shall I begin? Where I first encountered Hoca Efendi, where I first encountered Hizmet, or shall I plunge right into the story of Hoca Efendi that is contained within the pages of the book? Which? Second? Second, all right. The only people brave enough to speak have said Deftera. Okay, okay. So the book is actually the second book that I have written about him. I also co-edited a book of articles about him, and I have now written many different articles about different aspects of his thought. This book was suggested to me, actually, the topic of this book, the way I did this book, because there were biographies of Hoca Efendi, many of them, and many good ones in Turkish as well as in English. Not all of them are translated into Greek, but a few of them are. But it was suggested to me by a friend, some of you may know him, Emre Çelik, who is involved with Hizmet, that it would be interesting to interview people who are involved one way or another with Hizmet. And I thought that sounds like a great idea. So the shape of the book went as follows. I wanted to talk a bit because my expectation is that most of my audience would be coming from the United States, Europe, where they might not know much about him. Who is Fethullāh Gülen? When I first encountered the Hizmet movement in a group that was meeting together in Georgetown, and way led on to way, and I was asked whether I might consider writing a book about Hoca Efendi from the perspective of mysticism. It's one of the areas that I write on. I said, I don't know anything about him. And the only person I could turn to at that time, my colleague at Georgetown, is very much a white Turk, very much a Kemalist. And when I asked him what he thought of Fethullāh Gülen, of course, his response was the devil. So I realized, first of all, that this was someone I really wanted to learn about. And I began to read everything I could find that he had written, and everything that I could find written about him, to find out why there was such a strong reaction. And of course, I came to understand many things about him that figured both into the first book that I wrote, which mainly talked about the relationship between his thinking and that of Jalaluddin Rumi, but also Hoca Efendi's mind as such that he was connected to all kinds of thinkers, from Socrates, who used to wander around this city many, many, many years ago, as you know, to Said Nursi, from Ibn Arabi and Rumi to Einstein. An intriguing mind, to say the least, someone with a very broad and deep understanding of different patterns of thought across civilizations, plural. But when the time arrived to write my second book, this one important thing had happened, of which I was aware, that was crucial to the well-being of Hizmet, and that was I went to Turkey with the first book for book signings, but it was December of 2013. Most of you are perhaps too young to remember 2013 December. It was this month of the corruption scandal. And as much as the relationship between Fethullāh Gülen and what's that guy's name? Erdogan, that's it, I knew. Had already not been what once it had been, and as you all know, it was never what the Western press thinks it was. They were never close. They were never buddies. There was never a bromance, as we say in English. It was never Musk and Trump, but they had a relationship that worked for a while. That had already begun to change. But 2013 December marks a very important point in the further change of things, because it was very clear for me, the difference when I climbed onto the plane to go to Istanbul, and 6 days later I climbed on the plane to go back home from Istanbul, how things had changed. Why? Because you get on the plane and they offer you newspapers to read. And Her Zaman was very prominent among those that was available on the ride to Istanbul. By 6 days later, you could not find it. It's not that it wasn't being offered. You could not find Her Zaman. So I understood very clearly and very directly that aside from what people were telling me, that things were more than a little bit changed and changing. And I had not met Mr. Γκιουλέν at that point. I wrote the first book not having met him. I did not want to meet him before I wrote the first book because I did not want to be influenced by his personality. I wanted simply to focus on his thinking. After coming back from Turkey, I was very eager to meet him. So this first stage of eagerness is when my white Turkish colleague says the devil, and then I'm very eager to find out about his mind. And after December 13, I was very eager to find out about him. And the meeting was one that was, for me, transforming. It was that rare experience. When you meet someone whom you have admired from a distance, and not only is it not a disappointment, because so often it is, because the sports star, the movie star, the book author, the politician, who seemed so wonderful at a distance, turns out not to be. Not only was it not that, it was the opposite of that. Meeting him, he was far more than I could ever have imagined based on what I had read by him and about him. His charisma, his intelligence, his compassion, his humility. I've known many fake, humble people in my life. This was not fake humility. This was genuine humility. This was genuine, I care about others, not myself. Everything about him was extraordinary. And the relationship, of course, went forward there continuously along the same sorts of lines. I was privileged to meet him a number of times thereafter, to have a number of conversations with him. And each time, it reconfirmed what an extraordinary individual he was. So when the time to write the second book came, I already felt comfortable knowing about him, but I realized I still didn't know enough about his biography. And so I dug deeper. I had access to Turkish sources that I did not for my first book. The story of his family, its heritage, his mother who taught him Quran from when he was small, his father who was a respected imam, the fact that he was a hafiz by the age of 12, it may have been by the age of 10. I've read different sources, but anyway, young. And his first complication as someone who was drawn to a life of traditional piety, as an elementary school student. He's in Ataturk's secular Turkey, secular along the French lines, laïcité, not along the American lines, where you're supposed to separate church from state, but you can express your religious perspective anywhere. In France, you can't. And in Turkey, under Ataturk, you could not. You couldn't wear a headscarf as a woman on the streets of Turkey. I remember the first time I visited Turkey, which is way before most of you were born, and I remember noticing that. I thought, this is odd. It's a Muslim country. They're not dressed in anything that is distinctive about Muslim customs. And of course, I came to understand it was because of that strict secularity that was part of it. You probably know that if you look Hoca Efendi up on the internet, and it'll have his birth year is 1941. He was born in 1938, but his father was not permitted to register his birth at that point because he dared to name him Fethullāh with the word Allah in his name. So it took 3 years until a sympathetic clerk who knew and respected his father for what he was said, we can register your son. So already in elementary school, when he was drawn to pray 5 times a day, his teacher in the 2nd or 3rd grade said, you may not do that. This is not permitted. Very interesting. He also had teachers who supported him. But I came to know more about his life as he was growing up, as he became so well versed, not just in Quran and Hadith and all kinds of literature that is associated traditionally with Islam, but also how he, on the one hand, decided to become an imam, an interesting choice in secular Turkey to want to become an imam, an interesting pattern that one has to follow the course of study that is set out by the government, and of course he did that. But already as an imam, he was not like other imams. It's not just that he refused to take things that he could, that were his, the water that he used, the electricity that he used, but he paid for it out of his salary. He wouldn't just accept it. He was sleeping for a while in the mosque, in the masjid itself, in a kind of window, because he needed to save his money. And what was he saving his money for? Because early on he realized Turkish youth are afloat. They lost. And he realized they're lost because they're disconnected from their Muslim roots. After all, Turkey has been a Muslim country for centuries, for 600, 700 years. And the impermissibility of knowing anything about Islam has left them with nothing. And he realized, and they're not going to come to the masjid to hear my sohbet on Friday, on Jummah, noon prayers. So he had to go out. You all know this. This is famous. Going not to nice coffee shops like this. No, those were not the coffee shops he was going to. He was going to coffee shops in much more interesting areas, more interesting coffee shops. And you understand that his formal education outside the Muslim curriculum ended at the age of 14. So he hadn't really studied physics and chemistry and literature and things of that sort. But he also understood that the young people who were coming to the cafes with whom he wanted to speak were going to ask questions about that. What's the relationship between Islam and physics? Is there any? Can it be a scientist and a Muslim at the same time? He didn't yet know, but he would come to know, that Said Nursi had in his own direction preached the possibilities of interweaving Islam with the modern world, that there is no contradiction between science and religion inherently. Einstein wrote the same in the 1940s in his essays on science and religion. There's no contradiction. They just take you in different directions. Science, Einstein wrote, tells you what is. Religion tells you what should be. So if science tells me that I can put this weed killer on my grass and it will kill the weeds, but it will also sink into the earth and poison the water from my neighborhood, religion is what tells me to think about whether I should or should not do that. Science won't do that. Science just tells me this is what will happen. Religion is what tells me to think about the consequences of what I'm doing. So Fethullāh Gülen knew that these were the kind of questions he'd be asked. So that meant that he had to learn about these things if he could answer questions intelligently. And when he'd have conversations with young people and they'd ask a question, and he could probably have made up some answer because he was so smart and he knew more than they did, he wouldn't do that because he also had integrity. He would never tell an untruth. So he'd say, I don't know the answer to that question. Come back tomorrow and I will. Which meant he kept bringing them back and bringing them in. But it also meant that every evening he was at home. This is no internet, you understand. This is a different kind of challenge to find the books and the articles and to read them. And you see, it's not just that he had the kind of memory that could memorize everything. That's why he was a hafiz. But also the kind of mind that could analyze and understand things. Because, as you know, you could know every word of the Quran every ayat, every surah, and still not understand what it means. He was also digging into what things meant. And that would be true when he became a teacher of Quran. People who studied with him in the retreat center in Pennsylvania, where he lived since 1999, would tell stories about coming into the discussion, the sohbet, in the masjid every morning. And for 2 or 3 days, we've been discussing a particular ayat. And we're thinking, okay, it's time to move on. And Hoja Effendi says, no, we're not finished with this ayat yet. Because he was always digging deeper, and then bringing up this commentator and that commentator and why this works and why that doesn't work, and how to kind of weave it together in a comprehensive sense. But meanwhile, at the same time, he is understanding physics, and he's understanding chemistry, and he's understanding filmmaking, and he's understanding literature of diverse sorts. He's understanding philosophy, so that not only could he have conversations with young people who are interested in all these things, but clearly his intellect, his memory, his analytic mind, his integrity, but also his charisma made him a compelling discusser of things. Because I can know everything about everything and be so boring that all you want to do is leave, or at least close your eyes and sleep. But he was constantly engaging them, and they were starting to record what he was saying. And of course, those recordings would get spread further and further. And soon, he's become the most famous imam in all of Turkey. But by then, he had figured something else out, or had not figured it out, come to a different kind of realization. This isn't a problem for Turkish youth or for Muslim youth. It's a problem for youth everywhere. It doesn't matter whether they're in Turkey or whether they're in France, or whether they're Muslim, or whether they're Christian, or whether they're Jewish, or whether they're Hindu. This is a problem that is universal, and therefore it's a problem that cannot be solved just by me being an imam here in Turkey with students here. It's somehow something that needs to be spread further afield, out into the world. And he had the capacity, because of his charisma, not only to envision how one can deal with the problems of the world, which he began to think of as problems in 3 particular directions. One, ignorance. So the solution, of course, to that is education. The second is poverty. The solution to that is programs that help address poverty. And strife, both within Islam, within Turkey, and interfaith and interethnic and intercultural and international strife. And the way to deal with that is programs that bring people together for discussions, for dialogue, as you were talking about, Hassan Bey. Dialogue, where we try to understand each other. An obvious universalist idea that doesn't occur to most people. It's an idea that had occurred to someone like Rumi. He wasn't talking dialogue, but he was understanding across faiths while never abandoning his own. The same was true of Ibn Arabi. Socrates was interested in dialogue, but his world was narrow. He was interested in dialogue for Athenians, not even Greeks in general. It was Athenians. But Hoja Effendi is thinking about dialogues across the world, ultimately. That's his vision. You can have a vision. How do you make it work? You don't have the charisma, you don't have the capacity. He had that. So I need, he thought, first of all, to start to create schools here in Turkey for people who don't have the opportunity to learn about these things. And that means finding patrons who will help you. And finding patrons who will help you to create schools is a different skill from knowing the Quran from back to front and front to back, but it's a skill that he possessed. If a kid comes like Fethullāh Gülen did from eastern Turkey, from Anatolia, and I come to Izmir or Istanbul, it's a big city. What am I going to do there? How am I going to negotiate the city? So it's not just enough to provide schools. You need to provide what, of course, he called houses of light, lighthouses, where people could come not only to study, but have place to stay. And not just that, but a system of abis, of hablar, in order to have kids who are a few years older than the kids coming in not only help tutor you with your physics, but help you negotiate the terrain of Izmir, which is so foreign from the terrain of Trebizond, from which you came, you know, whatever. And as you know, over time, extraordinarily, think about this, one guy inspires more than 1,000 schools in Turkey alone. But then his idea is that we need to go beyond this. And so by the early 1990s, he was already suggesting to people, there are several of them here in this room who can tell you, about going first, not far away, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, but eventually up into Chechnya, over into Albania and the Balkans, and eventually to Australia, to New Zealand, to Germany, to France, to the United States, to Canada, to Mexico. Even, what's that place called? Hellas? How do we say it in English? Greece, I think, right? Did I get that right? Even to Greece. And so an extraordinary network, of course, is created. A network which, when I first encountered it, by the way, called itself the Γκιουλέν movement. And I remember the first time I went to a conference in Philadelphia, and I raised my hand, I said, calling it the Γκιουλέν movement is not a good idea because to American ears it sounds like a cult. And one of my Turkish friends said, well, he hates it when we call it that because he doesn't like it focused on himself. A better word is hizmet because that's what it's about, serving others. I also asked a second question at that conference. I was very brave in those days. I said, the word tolerance that keeps being used is not a good word. One of my favorite books by Hoca Efendi is called in English Love and Tolerance because it expresses his thoughts in these essays so beautifully. But I said, tolerance is I'm here and you're there. And what you're talking about is something this way, not that way. And again, one of my Turkish friends said, well, it's a bad translation of hoşgörü. So I came to interpret hoşgörü as seeing the world from in someone else's eyes. And if that's too awkward, well, let's just say embrace. So the first book was called Embracing the World for that reason. But his sense of this just kept expanding. The creation of programs that would deal with poverty, not just in Turkey, but elsewhere. Schools, not just in Turkey, but elsewhere. And eventually, of course, all kinds of programs of dialogue, in particular in the United States, they're very popular, interfaith iftar dialogues, because then you have a whole month in your community to try and invite people. Sometimes it's in your home, so there are 5 or 6 or 7 people. I've been to interfaith iftar dinners with 150 people. And that's an opportunity over food, which I know Turks and Greeks know nothing about food, of course. But over food, you can have a conversation on a different level. It's not about preaching, it's not about teaching, it's just about being together and talking together and trying to inform each other about each other. And it has, of course, its roots right in the Quran itself. I've made you of different tribes so that you can come to know one another. It's in Rumi. Rumi says, come, whoever you are. But Fethullah Gülen said, it's not just come, whoever you are. You have to go to where they are to bring them in to conversation. So by 2015, I guess it was, I started this book, the first part of which was the kind of biographical details I'm talking about, and others. I mean, I can go on and on. I'll just give you one because it's my favorite example of a combination of two things. I was in Sydney, Australia, and I visited a school, and the seniors had as a job to grow organic vegetables on the school grounds because there was a nice field near the school. And in that part of Sydney, Australia, there are no organic vegetables. So first of all, they're learning in a way that you don't learn from books. What does it take to grow organic vegetables? They're not just there in the store. The farmer has to worry about the soil and the wind and the rain and the sun and the insects and the heat and the cold, all of those things. But then they would take the organic vegetables and they would sell them in the neighborhood. And of course, that meant that they were getting to know people in the neighborhood. But then thirdly, they were also tasked with finding a community to which they could send the money they earned from the organic vegetables to help that community. So the particular time I was in Sydney at this school, they had found a village in Mali in Africa with no easy access to fresh water. The river was a mile away. That's a long distance to carry a jug of water back and forth on your head. They provided the funds to dig a well and to provide a piping system. The funny thing about Hizmet is, when an idea works in one place, it starts to spread and you find it in other places. I was 2 years later, this is just a year ago exactly, in Berlin, Germany, and the woman who was in charge of the Hizmet schools, because there are 6 of them there, was telling me about this program, about our seniors grow organic vegetables. They sell the vegetables. They send money to a village in Africa. I said, you're kidding me. The same idea repeating itself because it works, because it encompasses the different aspects of the things that concerned Hoca Efendi about not just youth, but about the world. So about him on the one hand, but then it was all of those interviews, 70, 75, 80 people, some of them knowing him for years, some of them just recently having met Hizmet. Turks, non-Turks, Muslims, non-Muslims, Jews, Christians, Jains, Sikhs, Hindus, so many people whom I encountered in Australia, New Zealand, different communities across the States, across Europe, Tbilisi, Georgia. Interviews conducted in English, in French, in German, and in Turkish. So it's a big project. And it took a while to move from transcribing the interviews to then editing them, because, you know, when you speak, it's a little bit different from when you write. So you have to edit. And if you're interviewing me, I might tell you things that actually don't belong in the book you want to write with me in it, because it relates, but you're trying to focus. So it took a while, and then July 2016 came around. And I remember the day after the news of the coup occurred, as soon as I read about it, I said, wait, this is not a failed coup, this is a fake coup. It's very obvious that Erdogan himself organized it. I mean, there are 2 things that Turks know about. One is food, and the other is coups. They do a coup every 10 years. So they know that you do it in the middle of the night. You don't do it at rush hour. You do it so that you round up the people you need to round up immediately. You don't have the main person who is the object of your coup running around free up on the bridge with his cell phone, calling to his friends. And isn't it remarkable that in 1 hour, Mr. Erdogan has a list of 144 names of the coup perpetrators? How is that possible? But of course, everywhere I read, it kept talking about the failed coup. The culmination of which was my best friend reading an article in a very fine publication in the United States. It's called New Yorker magazine. Its journalists win prizes all the time. They're considered very truthful. They have integrity. They do their research. They look things up. They don't print anything that's not true. And this was an article about Fethullahh Gülen, which was very negative. And my friend said, I know you know him. Tell me what's going on here. And when I read it, I was outraged, because it was very clear that this reporter had not done any homework, had not done any research. Erdogan could have written the article. So that's when I pushed very hard to finish my book, because I thought, there's got to be pushback against the lies that Erdogan spews. He has control of the media. And to my astonishment, journalists who should be smarter and know better apparently are not. You know, the last election, which Mr. Erdogan won by 53, 56, whatever, percent, something like that. I had a conversation with an American journalist. He said, I know it was a real election because you know how dictators are. He would have won by 95%. I said, you're stupid, aren't you? He's smarter than you are. Of course, he controls every aspect of the election. You really think he only won by 56% because he only won by 56%? That's what he wanted people like you, who are then going to report to the world that it was genuine, to believe, because he knows you're dumb enough to believe that. It is an uphill battle. And I come from a country where at the moment, just as Mr. Erdogan planned the fake coup modeled on the burning of the Reichstag in 1933 February by his model and his idol, Adolf Hitler, who, controlling the media, was able to promote the lie that it was the communists who were his key enemies who burnt it down, and then he rounded them all up. Does this sound familiar? Just as Erdogan followed that model, he called it a gift from Allah. It wasn't a gift from Allah. It was his own gift to himself. It was his own birthday present to himself, so he could continue to promote and expand the idea that anything and everything that happens that is bad in Turkey is, of course, the consequence of Hizmet. You know, by the way, that the earthquake a few years ago was Hizmet. You know that it was because of Hizmet somehow. So we have someone, of course, who is trying to perform the same service for our country, remove the democracy and turn it into dictatorship. So I understand how easy it apparently is for many people to be deceived by someone who has some crazy kind of charismatic self-representation, even if it's not real. So my passion for having this book out was connected to my passion for truth and for wanting the truth about Hizmet and the truth about its opposition to be out in the world. I'm very frank about it at the beginning of the book. This is why this book needs to be read. Just as I'm frank at the part of the book where I introduce interviews, at pointing out that there were people who were afraid to be in the book because it took about 2 years till publication. And I said, what about if we use fake names, pseudonyms? Because they're afraid, because they have families back in Turkey. And almost everybody agreed under those circumstances. So it's a tricky proposition. And then I'll finish up and then open things up to comments or questions. The irony is that what Hoca Efendi envisioned, as I said a few moments back in the early 1990s, was Hizmet people going out all over the world, serving, being engaged, being involved, helping solve its problems by being engaged and involved with others, with the common goals to do that. And the irony is that Erdogan has helped that, not harmed that. He has forced a bigger diaspora than might otherwise be the case. That doesn't mean, of course, that it's not tragic, because we understand how many members of Hizmet are still in Turkey and in danger. We understand how many he's arrested, how many he's imprisoned, how many he has murdered, and how he has reached out beyond the bounds of Turkey. A year ago, just before the passing of Hoca Efendi, as you all remember, 5 teachers from Kenya were arrested. Those were Turkish soldiers who were permitted to do so. 2 of them were let go because they were British citizens and the British complained. The other 3 where are they? Somewhere in prison in Turkey. So I understand that, and it's not to dismiss or to diminish the tragic quality of what he has affected. But fundamentally, his plan of destruction has not only failed, it's backfired, because Hizmet is flourishing. A year ago, with the passing of Hoca Efendi, I felt sort of 4 things. I said this yesterday, so for those of you who are there, it's a repeat. I apologize. Just close your eyes, close your ears, relax. There's happiness and sadness. Happiness because for him, for Haj Effendi, as a Sufi, even though his humility prevented him from ever saying, I am a Sufi, because he understood that that's a compliment. But if you know his work, you know that not only did he write books about Sufism, but if you read the first volume of his first 4 volumes on Sufism, it's kind of a biography of himself. He was a Sufi, and in that sense, he's returned to the beloved source. So for him, it was a happy event. Also happy because of what from that point to this I have seen, which is Hizmet not folding, not collapsing, not shrinking, not in disarray, not in chaos, but on the contrary, flourishing. Both the older generation and the younger generation, so that I see a very strong future for Hizmet, a future that will be in constant flux and change, except with respect to the importance of the values that Haj Effendi preached and taught and wrote about for his entire life. Sadness, of course, well, of course, how could I not feel sad, knowing that I would never have a chance to look into his eyes again, to feel the things I felt each time that I would see him. And sadness for all the other people who feel that way, people who've known him longer and better than I, who would feel that way. Sadness for younger people, I said this yesterday, younger people who won't get the chance to meet him the way I had the chance to meet him, because they don't. Hearing him, seeing him on tape, reading his writings is not the same as meeting him. But I changed my mind about that a month ago at a conference in the States, in New Jersey, it was a weekend conference on the legacy of Fethullāh Gülen. At the very first session, I spoke and I said, I'm going to laugh all weekend because Haj Effendi would be so offended at this conference. He hated things that were about himself, and we do him a disservice if we spend too much time talking about him and not about the ideas that he was constantly trying to promote, the ideas that would help fix the world. That's what he would want us to focus on, not on him. So then I started to think, actually, young people who haven't met him maybe have an advantage over those of us who have. Because for me, for example, I can't disentangle him from his thinking. But for someone who has not met him, they're like I was way back at the beginning when I hadn't met him yet. And it was just the thinking with which I dealt and upon which I focused. So maybe that is a good thing. They have an advantage over us because they'll only be dealing with his thinking and not with his personality. They'll have lost something, but they'll have gained things that we can't. So we move into the future. The fact that we are all here in Athens, I don't need to tell you, is itself a testament to what his thinking is about and its importance. The historical relationship between Greece and Turkey is not a beautiful one. And Greeks, for good reasons, would be suspicious of a Turkish organization implanting itself in Greece, Stinatini, in Athens. But Hizmet is and makes it clear about itself is so unique with respect to its interests and its intentions that even here it finds enormous reception, particularly since 2016, particularly since it's very clear that not only is Hizmet not a servant of the government, but on the contrary, it's the most distinct and distinguished enemy of the government, whose leader is so obsessed with Fethullāh Gülen, with Haj Effendi, and with Hizmet. One last story, then I'll open it up. Because I asked Haj Effendi once why Erdogan is so negative about him. And he said immediately, he said, back when we were still speaking, he was going to attend a political meeting which I knew was dangerous for him. And I picked up the phone and I said, Rajib, you shouldn't go to this meeting because it's dangerous. And he's worried that at some point, someday I will tell about that, expose him, and it will be dangerous for him politically. I would never do that, he said to me. I'm not even telling you the details. I said, I know, but he cannot imagine someone like you. He cannot imagine someone with your integrity. He cannot imagine that you wouldn't take advantage of a political situation, because he would, of course. He doesn't get it that your interest is not in politics and political power and political Islam, but that your interest is in civil and civic and spiritual and cultural Islam. For myself, if you are familiar, and I asked this question yesterday, with the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and if you're not, the most important feature of it I'll share with you so you'll understand what I'm saying, is that Snow White has this wicked stepmother who has a mirror, ayna, for those of you who know a few words of Turkish. And every morning she looks at the mirror and she says, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? And the mirror says, you are. One morning the mirror says, Snow White is. And it drives this wicked stepmother crazy. She's got to kill her. And I've had this picture for years of Mr. Erdogan every morning in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie and asking it, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the most pious Muslim of them all? And the mirror always answers, Fethullāh Gülen. And it drives him crazy. And alas, that hasn't changed even in the last year. But Hizmet will prevail because of what it is and what it does, and because of all the people out here who make it what it is and make it what it does. Teşekkür ve ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Καλησπέρα και από μένα. Θα μου επιτρέψετε να ξεκινήσω με ένα χρονικό, με μια σύντομη ιστορία της εκδοτικής παρουσίας του Φετχουλλάχ Γκιουλέν και του κινήματος Χισμέτ στην Ελλάδα. Είναι κάτι το οποίο μπορούμε πια να το κάνουμε, δηλαδή έχουν περάσει αρκετά χρόνια και έχουν περάσει και αρκετά βιβλία, οπότε μπορούμε να κάνουμε μια τέτοια ιστορία και να παρουσιάσουμε την ιστορία αυτή της εκδοτικής παρουσίας του κινήματος Χισμέτ στην Ελλάδα. Το πρώτο βιβλίο, έχω την τιμή να πω ότι ήταν το δικό μου το βιβλίο, πριν βγουν βιβλία του ίδιου του Γκιουλέν το 2009. Είναι το «Παγκοσμιοποίηση, Εθνικισμός και Ισλάμ» από τις εκδόσεις βεβαίως Παπαζήσει για τον Γκιουλέν. Και τότε πολλά πράγματα για τον Γκιουλέν και το κίνημα Χισμέτ δεν ήταν γνωστά στην Ελλάδα, ήταν μάλιστα σχεδόν άγνωστα ή ήταν και αρνητικά. Το 2013 είναι το πρώτο βιβλίο του ίδιου του Γκιουλέν που βγαίνει, το «Αγάπη και ανεκτικότητα», με αυτή την κακή λέξη tolerance, ανεκτικότητα, που λέμε όλοι ότι στην πραγματικότητα είναι λάθος μετάφραση από τα τουρκικά στα αγγλικά και από τα αγγλικά στα ελληνικά. Είναι λάθος λέξη, δεν είναι στην πραγματικότητα ανεκτικότητα, γιατί ανεκτικότητα είναι να είσαι πάνω και να βλέπεις με κάποια, ας πούμε, και λίγο περιφρόνηση των άλλων. Εντάξει, είσαι ανεκτικός. Ενώ στην πραγματικότητα είναι ενσυναίσθηση. Είναι εσγκυρή, είναι εστιναίσθηση. 2014 έχουμε τον διάλογο πολιτισμών της Τζιλ Κάρολ, όπου είναι πολύ ενδιαφέρον βιβλίο που συγκρίνει την σκέψη του Γκιουλέν με τη σκέψη του Κομφούκιου, του Πλάτωνα, του Σάρτρα κτλ. Εξαιρετικά ενδιαφέρον βιβλίο. Το 2020 έχουμε βεβαίως τον Τζον Πολ με την βιογραφία του Γκιουλέν, που είναι πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρον βιβλίο και πολύ σημαντικό, γιατί και πολύ μεγάλο και ήταν και πολύ πλούσιο βιβλίο να μεταφραστεί. Το 2022 έχουμε τον Φαρόκ Μερτζάν, «Μόνη μας λύση η δημοκρατία», όπου στην πραγματικότητα είναι μια συλλογή λόγων και συνεντεύξεων του ίδιου του κύριου Γκιουλέν για διάφορα θέματα, όχι μόνο πολιτικά και κοινωνικά. Εξαιρετικά ενδιαφέρον βιβλίο και αυτό. Και πέρσι, το 2024, είχαμε το βιβλίο του Τσαΐρογλου, Φετχουλλάχ Γκιουλέν, ένας άνθρωπος σκέψης, ιδεών και δράσης, που είναι πάλι μια βιογραφία του Γκιουλέν, αλλά περισσότερο από μια ισλαμική προοπτική. Δηλαδή, ουσιαστικά εξετάζει τον Φετχουλλάχ Γκιουλέν μέσα από ένα ισλαμικό πρίσμα εξετάζει κυρίως αυτό που λέμε την ισλαμική του ευλάβεια και ευσέβεια. Αυτό είναι το 7ο λοιπόν βιβλίο για τον Φετχουλλάχ Γκιουλέν και το κίνημα Χισμέτ στα ελληνικά και στην Ελλάδα που βγαίνει, το βιβλίο του Όρι Σόλετς, και έκανα αυτή την εισαγωγή για να πάμε στο ποια είναι τα διαφορετικά στοιχεία του βιβλίου αυτού. Υπάρχουν δύο σημαντικά διαφορετικά στοιχεία. Το πρώτο είναι ότι αποτελεί κυρίως αυτό που λέει και ο ίδιος μία πνευματική, μία διανοητική βιογραφία. Στα αγγλικά είναι intellectual, αλλά προτίμησα να το μεταφράσω ως πνευματική, με την έννοια ότι συνδυάζει το διανοητικό στοιχείο, δηλαδή την διανοητική γενεολογία του Φετχουλλάχ Γκιουλέν με την πνευματικότητα. Άρα έχουμε αυτό το κύριο στοιχείο, εκεί δίνεται έμφαση στο ποιοι είναι οι γενεολογικοί προπάτορες πνευματικοί και διανοητικοί του Φετχουλλάχ Γκιουλέν. Ο Ιμπν Άραμπι, αναφέρθηκε και ο φίλος μου Όρι προηγουμένως, ο Ιμπν Άραμπι, η Ραμπία, ο Γιουνούς Εμρέ, βεβαίως ο Ρουμί, βεβαίως ο Πλάτωνας, στον οποίο πολλές φορές αναφέρεται και στο Σοκράτη ο ίδιος ο Γκιουλέν, και όταν τον συναντήσαμε αναφέρθηκε, εννοείται, στον Σοκράτη και στον Πλάτωνα. Βεβαίως ο Αϊνστάιν, πάνω απ' όλα, κάτι το οποίο πολλές φορές δεν το παραβλέπουμε ή δεν αναφερόμαστε πάρα πολύ συχνά σε αυτό. Το πολύ σημαντικό στοιχείο του Φετχουλλάχ Γκιουλέν είναι η επιστροφή του, συνεχής επιστροφή του στα θεμέλια της πίστης. Επειδή ήταν ένας άνθρωπος ο οποίος είχε τεράστια γνώση σε σχέση με τα βασικά του Ισλάμ, επιστρέφει συνεχώς σε αυτά και μπορούσε να αντλήσει, να πάρει παραδείγματα από όλο το εύρος της Ισλαμικής γνώσης. Βεβαίως από το Κοράνι, αλλά και από αυτό που λέμε την βιβλιογραφία του ταφσίρ, δηλαδή των ερμηνειών για το Κοράνι και για τα Χαντίθ. Τεράστια γνώση και μπορούσε να το κάνει αυτό συνδυαστικά. Το δεύτερο στοιχείο που διαφοροποιεί το βιβλίο αυτό από όλα τα άλλα βιβλία για τον Γκιουλέν, και αυτό είναι το εξαιρετικά ενδιαφέρον για μένα, είναι ότι δεν είναι μόνο μία βιογραφία του Γκιουλέν, διανοητική ή πνευματική, αλλά είναι κυρίως μία βιογραφία διανοητική και πνευματική του ίδιου του κινήματος Χισμέτ. Και πώς το κάνει αυτό ο Σόλτες? Το κάνει μέσα από συνεντεύξεις με μέλη του κινήματος Χισμέτ, και όχι μόνο κινήματος Χισμέτ, όχι μόνο μέλη του κινήματος Χισμέτ, ανθρώπους που έχουν επηρεαστεί από το κίνημα Χισμέτ στη ζωή τους και από τον Φετχουλλάχ Γκιουλέν. Άρα έχουμε 160 σελίδες μιας βιογραφίας πνευματικής και διανοητικής και 160 σελίδες μιας βιογραφίας πνευματικής και διανοητικής για το κίνημα Χισμέτ, μέσα από 72 και μία συνεντεύξεις, 73, αλλά η τελευταία δεν είναι ακριβώς συνέντευξη, είναι με τον Τζον Πολ, συζήτηση πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα με τον Τζον Πολ. Άρα έχουμε 72 συνεντεύξεις, έχουμε 31 συνεντεύξεις από τον πρώτο κύκλο των μαθητών, τον πρώτο κύκλο των ανθρώπων που γεννήθηκαν στην Τουρκία, που ήταν οι πρώτοι οι οποίοι ακολούθησαν τον Γκιουλέν. Έχουμε 22 συνεντεύξεις με νεότερους, κάποιους οι οποίοι δεν γεννήθηκαν στην Τουρκία, κάποιους που δεν είναι Τούρκοι, μπορεί να είναι μουσουλμάνοι αλλά εκτός Τουρκίας, και έχουμε και 19 συνεντεύξεις με ανθρώπους οι οποίοι μπορεί να είναι άσχετοι σε σχέση με το Ισλάμ, μπορεί να είναι μη μουσουλμάνοι, μπορεί να είναι μη Τούρκοι, άνθρωποι οι οποίοι όμως έχουν επηρεαστεί στη ζωή τους από το κίνημα Χισμέτ και από τον κύριο Γκιουλέν. Για εμένα το βιβλίο ήταν εξαιρετικά ενδιαφέρουσα εμπειρία, γιατί κάποιους από αυτούς τους ανθρώπους τους έχω γνωρίσει, οπότε ήταν πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρον να διαβάζω την ζωή και την άποψη και τις ιδέες ανθρώπων που είχα γνωρίσει, είτε στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες, είτε στην Τουρκία, είτε στη Γερμανία, είτε πρόσφατα στην Αυστραλία, αλλά έβλεπα μέσα από τις σελίδες του βιβλίου ανθρώπους που είχα γνωρίσει και τους έφερνα στο μυαλό μου. Για παράδειγμα, βεβαίως, εννοείται τον Εμρέ Τσελίκ, εννοείται προφανώς, αλλά και πολλούς άλλους. Είναι πολύ ενδιαφέρον γιατί αναφέρει το πώς ήρθαν αυτοί οι άνθρωποι σε επαφή με το κίνημα Χισμέτ. Άρα έχουμε προσωπικές ιστορίες ανθρώπων που προέρχονταν πολλές φορές και από περιβάλλοντα μη θρησκευτικά και μαλικά. Άρα πώς από κεμαλικά περιβάλλοντα προσελκύστηκαν από τις ιδέες του κινήματος και πήγαν, καταλαβαίνετε τι τεράστια διαδρομή είναι αυτή, από κεμαλικά περιβάλλοντα να κινηθούν προς το κίνημα Χισμέτ. Έχουμε αναφορές πολλές και σε σχέση με τους προβληματισμούς αυτών των ανθρώπων, πώς από οικογένειες και από γονείς κοσμικόδοξους και κεμαλιστές κινήθηκαν προς αυτήν την κατεύθυνση. Και αυτό καθιστά το βιβλίο ένα βιβλίο το οποίο γράφει με πολύ μεγάλη αγάπη βεβαίως, αλλά θα πω και με πολύ μεγάλη ειλικρίνεια. Και αυτό είναι εξαιρετικά σημαντικό στοιχείο. Στη μετάφραση, γιατί πάντα πρέπει να αναφερόμαστε στο ταξίδι της μετάφρασης, είχα και ευκολίες και δυσκολίες. Η ευκολία ήταν ότι δεν είχα τις δυσκολίες άλλων βιβλίων. Για παράδειγμα, στο βιβλίο του Τζον Πολ υπήρχε ένα τέτοιο στοιχείο, ότι ήμουν αναγκασμένος να εξηγώ προς τον Έλληνα αναγνώστη κάποια πράγματα που γράφονται με διαφορετικό τρόπο από ό,τι έχουμε συνηθίσει εμείς στην Ελλάδα. Για παράδειγμα, ο πόλεμος της ανεξαρτησίας της Τουρκίας είναι η δική μας μικρασιατική καταστροφή και πρέπει αυτό να το αναφέρεις. Εδώ δεν είχαμε τέτοιες δυσκολίες, δεν είναι ιστορικό βιβλίο. Έπρεπε όμως να κάνω αρκετές σημειώσεις και σε σχέση με ισλαμικούς όρους που δεν είναι ιδιαίτερα γνωστοί στην Ελλάδα και σε σχέση με την τύχη ανθρώπων που αναφέρονται στο βιβλίο, για παράδειγμα ο Πεκμετζή, ο οποίος λίγο μετά πέθανε και έπρεπε να βρω στοιχεία και έπρεπε να το αναφέρω αυτό. Επίσης έπρεπε να αναφέρω κάτι πολύ ενδιαφέρον που το έχει ο συγγραφέας. Κάποιες λέξεις ήταν στα ελληνικά. Δηλαδή η λέξη λόγος, η λέξη έργο, επειδή ακριβώς αναφέρονται στην σοκρατική σκέψη, έπρεπε να αναφέρω ότι αυτά γράφονται στα ελληνικά. Είναι ένα πολύ ενδιαφέρον βιβλίο, γιατί πάλι εννοείται, βλέπουμε την ιστορία της Τουρκίας, βλέπουμε την ιστορία ενός κινήματος το οποίο προφανώς, όπως είπε και ο Όρι Σόλετς, θα παραμείνει εν ζωή, θα μεγαλώσει, θα δυναμώσει. Και επιτρέψτε μου και εμένα να αναφερθώ σε κάτι που είπα και χθες, γιατί θα δυναμώσει και θα μεγαλώσει. Όσοι το ακούσατε και χθες, μην το ακούσετε σήμερα, αλλά νομίζω ότι μπορώ να το πω. Είπα και χθες ότι υπάρχει η ιστορία του πολύ γνωστού ψυχίατρου Βίκτορ Φράνκλ, ο οποίος ήταν επιζών, έχει πεθάνει βεβαίως στο ολοκαυτώματος. Ο Βίκτορ Φράνκλ πέρασε τα 4 χρόνια του πολέμου, 5 σε στρατόπεδο στην αρχή εργασίας και μετά εξόντωσης, γλίτωσε στο Παρατσάκ και αναφέρει το εξής στο βιβλίο του που έγραψε μετά. Βγήκε από τα στρατόπεδα 37 κιλά και έγραψε μετά ένα βιβλίο, «Το νόημα της ζωής». Και αναφέρει ο Βίκτορ Φράνκλ ότι στην πραγματικότητα έζησε και γλίτωσε μέσα στα στρατόπεδα επειδή έδωσε νόημα στη ζωή του. Και έγραψε ότι δεν έχει σημασία αν είσαι δυνατός σωματικά. Οι πιο δυνατοί άνθρωποι σωματικά πεθαίναν αμέσως. Γιατί δεν είχαν νόημα. Δεν είχαν κάποιο νόημα, κάποιο λόγο για τον οποίο θα παρέμειναν και θα έβγαιναν από τα στρατόπεδα ζωντανοί. Αυτός αναφέρει λοιπόν ότι ο λόγος για τον οποίο έζησε ήταν επειδή οι Ναζί εκείνη τη μέρα που τον πιάσανε, του σκίσαν το βιβλίο, του το κομματιάσανε. Είχε γράψει, μόλις τελειώσει το βιβλίο του. Και ήταν το μοναδικό χειρόγραφο. Του κάψαν λοιπόν το βιβλίο και αυτός επί 4 χρόνια θυμόταν συνέχεια αυτό το βιβλίο, λέξη προς λέξη, λέξη προς λέξη, λέξη προς λέξη. Το επαναλάμβανε στη ζωή του, στο κεφάλι του. Και στην πραγματικότητα έμεινε ζωντανός για 3 λόγους. Και αυτούς τους λόγους αναφέρει ως ουσιαστικά οι κύριοι παράγοντες νοηματοδότησης της ζωής ενός ανθρώπου. Άρα δεν έχει σημασία αν είσαι δυνατός σωματικά, έχει σημασία αν είσαι δυνατός πνευματικά και αν δίνεις νόημα με κάποιο τρόπο στη ζωή σου. 3 παράγοντες. Ο ένας είναι η δημιουργικότητα. Τον έχεις κάποια πράγματα για τα οποία να θέλεις να ζήσεις και μετά. Εντάξει, η δημιουργικότητα. Τον έχεις να κάνεις κάτι, να παράγεις ένα έργο. Το δεύτερο είναι αν έχεις κάποιον άνθρωπο για τον οποίο θέλεις να ζήσεις. Αυτός είχε την οικογένειά του, την οποία βεβαίως κατάλαβε μετά ότι είχε χάσει. Δεν είχαν ζήσει, αλλά αυτός δεν το ήξερε, το δεύτερο. Και το τρίτο, ποια είναι η στάση μας ως ανθρώπων απέναντι στις συμφορές, απέναντι στις δυστυχίες. Εντάξει. Και χθες το είπα, το λέω και σήμερα, οι άνθρωποι του κινήματος Χισμέτ, όπως έχουν νοηματοδοτηθεί από τις ιδέες του Φετχουλλάχ Γκιουλέν, έχουν και τα τρία αυτά στοιχεία, οπότε είναι δεδομένο ότι το κίνημα θα μεγαλώσει, θα δυναμώσει και θα απλώσει ακόμη περισσότερο ρίζες στον κόσμο. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Έχουμε ερωτήσεις, θέλουμε να ρωτήσουμε κάτι.
Came to my mind, and I want to ask it. Every action, every movement has an idea behind of it, and Hoca Efendi was active in both action and the idea parts, and with this way, he tried to educate the Hizmet volunteers. And we know that most of the movements had a stagnation of ideas in some time, and these stagnations led them to lacking depth and creativeness in their actions. And do you think that Hizmet will keep that richness of ideas and actions after Hoca Efendi's passing? And what specific situations we should focus on after?
Of course, I'm not a prophet, but as far as I can see, let me make two comparisons. One is with Socrates, who also emphasized logos and ergon, right? So word and action. And who himself didn't write a word, but who inspired his disciples, in particular Plato, but there were others as well, like Xenophon, to write about him and to convey his messages, that of course laid the foundations for ways of thinking that before him didn't exist in the West, and I'm thinking in particular of ethics, because physics and metaphysics, how the world works, those were questions that were being raised before him. But he was the first to raise the question, what do you mean by justice? What do you mean by friendship? What do you mean by holiness, by piety? What do you mean by the good, to agathon, right? And one might have supposed that when he died, it would have died with him, if not for his disciples, in particular Plato, who made it his job to immortalize his master by conveying the kind of dialogues he had had and the ideas that he had put forth. Socrates was always emphatic about not just speaking but doing. It's fine to talk about it, but doing about it. Nowhere is that more extraordinary than on his death, right? Where he theorizes about the soul and its immortality, and you can't prove it. And he adds another element called mythos, right? Mythos, if in proper, demotiki today, which is the story that he can't prove, as opposed to the reasoning process that he also can't prove. But in the end, when he drinks that hemlock, like it's the best chai he's ever had, it's the ergon that he is doing what he had spent his whole life doing. But Socrates would never have imagined, because his focus, as I said earlier, was on Athenians and the city of Athens and making it a better place, that his ideas would become the subject of interest across the world. Hoca Efendi is different from Socrates in his very early on having realized that the world has to be the arena in which the ideas he's promoting play out, but that the ideas are pointless unless they are acted upon. And that's, of course, what Hizmet is, and it's not just action, it's altruistic action. So you do what you do because you should, not because you're expecting a payback. He was driven to be what he was by his intense personal Muslim piety, but he understood that beliefs are beliefs because they're beliefs, because we drink them in with our mother's milk. We can't prove them. My perspective on Allah and yours may be different, but neither of us can convince the other that mine is right and yours is wrong. True dialogue is being comfortable with the proposition that for me, my concept of God is perfect, the most perfect on the planet. And that doesn't contradict the idea that yours is also perfect, but for you. And there can be many different perfections with respect to the understanding of God. In fact, it would be odd otherwise. God made the universe. That's what all people of faith believe. God loves what God created. No two trees are alike. No two leaves are alike. No two snowflakes are alike. No two people are alike. Why would it be that there's only one correct path to God instead of many, many, many different ones? Oh, and it happens to be mine. So he was very conscious of that. And therefore what one does because if one believes that one wants love with God, then one has to love humanity. But at a certain point, this was about 15 years ago, he made the comment, atheists, people who don't believe in God, who do good work, are doing God's work, they just don't know it. So that captures, in a nutshell, the particularities of your belief system aren't what matters. It's what you're doing to help the world that matters. As I said earlier, he had the capacity, the charisma, to inspire others to do so, and it's doing. It's going out and building schools. It's going out and creating anti-poverty programs. It's going out and engaging in projects and programs that bring people who are different from each other together. So, I still haven't quite answered your question. In his own way of being, he was such an extraordinary model. That's how he inspired everybody. But in the last 5 or 6 years of his life, he always wanted people to think for themselves. He never wanted them to do what he said to do. But those of us who were so enamored of him could often not resist doing what he proposed doing. When he said to members of Hizmet in 1991, 1993, 1995, I'd like you to go to Kazakhstan, I'd like you to go to Kyrgyzstan, I'd like you to go to North Korea, I'd like you to go to Chechnya. It was rare for someone to say, no, I'm not going to do that because of whatever it is he had about him. So that's how the movement spread. The last 5 or 6 years, he became less and less active in giving advice to the leaders of Hizmet who had convened in Pennsylvania at the retreat center where he'd lived since 1999 and come to him with questions as they always had. What do you think, Hoj Effendi? I have this issue in Melbourne, Australia. I have this issue in Paris. He'd say, I don't live in Paris. I don't live in Melbourne. You have to figure it out. So he was preparing the way for Hizmet to stand on its own feet and not on Gülen's shoulders, in spite of standing on his shoulders, of course, well before he went back to that beloved source. Therefore, I was not surprised when, after a year ago, when he passed, not only did things not collapse, I saw Hizmet so much more tightly occupied with continuing his legacy, with not falling apart, with expanding projects, expanding programs. And I've seen in the last year only that further growth rather than shrinkage. There was never a moment, as far as I know, where there were leaders who were arguing over who should be the next leader. So the other person to whom I would compare him is Muhammad. peace be unto him. Because when he passed on, as you know, there was a schism almost immediately. Should we follow Ali? Should we follow Abu Bakr? And the Muslim world has been split ever since, beyond all the other schisms that every religious tradition, of course, sustains. It's not unique to Islam, of course. I don't see that happening with the aftermath, the continuation. And I also think I see within, this is based on a conversation I had last week in a White House. In Cherry Hill, New Jersey, there were 7 young guys and 3 older people. They're all younger than I am, but older people. And the question came up about transition. How does leadership move from to the next generation? And the answer seemed kind of clear. The older guys, one of the older guys said, look, I'm ready to hand over. I don't need to stay in a position of leadership. So, because that's about ego. I need to be in charge. I need to be charged. That's ego. If I'm truly inspired by him, then I try and keep my ego out of it. And it also means for younger people, having an instinct and a sense of when you need to step forth and take responsibility. Hoja Effendi always wanted an even playing field, gender-wise. He came from a culture where the women were in the kitchen and the men were in the living room. And one of the first questions I asked about his met was, when do the women get to participate in the sohbets in the living room instead of just providing the food from the kitchen? And I have seen also in the last 10 years how that has been changing. In the places that I have visited, in more and more locations, women in charge. That's important. It's important that, and not easy, that it's not only and always going to be Turkish people in charge, even though it started out there. I am the chairman of the board of Rumi Forum. I'm not Turkish, I'm not Muslim. There's no contradiction there. The guy who is the director happens to be, well, he's actually a Kurd. Well, you know, according to Ataturk, that just makes him a mountain Turk, right? But my point is, I see there won't not be problems. There can't not be. But I see overall a growth, an expansion, an evolution, a development that will push positively towards the future as opposed to something collapsing within. That's my answer. Thank you.
Κάποια άλλη ερώτηση?
Ερώτηση. Βρίσκονται. Όχι. Δεν είναι τίποτε.
Όχι, την άλλη εβδομάδα. Την άλλη εβδομάδα. Εντάξει.
Περιμένουμε. Εδώ θα είμαι εδώ. Θα είμαι στο Washington. Θα γυρίσω.
Οπότε σας ευχαριστούμε και ευχαριστούμε τους ομιλητές.